Triadic models provide a structured and nuanced approach to understanding complex systems. These models focus on the interplay between three distinct elements, highlighting their interdependencies and the conditions necessary for various states or outcomes. In contrast, dialectical reasoning traditionally involves the analysis of contradictions between two opposing forces, known as the thesis and antithesis, leading to a synthesis. While both methods offer valuable insights, triadic models present several advantages in explaining systems, especially in scientific and technical contexts. Triadic models capture the intricate relationships between three components, allowing for a more detailed and nuanced understanding of systems. For example, in the example of a biochemical pathway, the interaction of two enzymes and a metabolic product reveals how the presence of any two ensures the function of the third, highlighting interdependencies that are more complex than binary oppositions. Dialectical reasoning, focusing on binary oppositions, may oversimplify interactions by reducing them to a conflict and resolution framework. While useful for highlighting contradictions and change, it may miss the subtleties of multi-component systems where more than two elements interact in significant ways. These models explicitly state the necessary conditions for relationships, making it clear what is required for certain outcomes. In an example involving sunlight, water, and nutrients, the model shows how each element supports the others, making the dependencies clear and quantifiable. Dialectical reasoning tends to focus on the dynamic process of thesis, antithesis, synthesis, which may not explicitly outline the necessary conditions for each state. This can make it harder to identify specific dependencies and the precise role of each element in the system. Triadic models can describe a wide range of systems by defining various types of relationships, such as harmonic, convergent, divergent. This flexibility allows them to be applied to different contexts with varying complexity, such as ecological systems, biochemical pathways, or electronic circuits, as seen in the examples provided. While dialectical reasoning is powerful for analyzing change and evolution in systems, it may be less flexible in describing stable, multifaceted interdependencies within a system. Its focus on conflict and resolution might not fully capture the stable yet complex interactions present in many scientific contexts. Enhanced predictive power. By clearly outlining the necessary conditions and interactions between three components, triadic models enhance predictive power. For instance, in a manufacturing example, understanding how the presence or absence of raw materials determines production outcomes can lead to more precise predictions and better resource management. Dialectical reasoning can predict changes based on the resolution of contradictions, but it might not provide the same level of detail in predicting specific outcomes within a stable system. It excels in dynamic contexts, but may be less effective in static or cyclic scenarios, where interactions are more about maintenance and balance than conflict and resolution. Comprehensive system analysis. Triadic models offer a comprehensive framework for analyzing systems by considering all relevant interactions and dependencies. The example of water purification demonstrates how multiple purification processes interact, providing a complete view of the system's functionality and potential points of failure. Dialectical reasoning provides insights into the process of change and development within a system, but might not offer a full picture of all interacting components at a given time. It excels in transformative analysis, but might overlook the steady-state interactions critical for understanding ongoing system behavior. Applying necessary conditions to real-world scenarios. To apply the logic of necessary conditions to real-world scenarios, one must identify the key elements and their interdependencies within a given system. This involves several steps. Identify key elements. Determine the primary components or variables in the system. For example, in an ecological study, these might be different species, environmental factors, and resources. Establish relationships. Define how these elements are related. Use logical expressions to represent these relationships, identifying which elements are necessary conditions for others. This helps in understanding how the absence or presence of one element impacts the others. Analyze scenarios. Examine specific scenarios by applying the logical relationships. Assess how changes in one part of the system affect the whole, and identify critical dependencies. This step often involves considering both positive and negative influences among the elements. Model and predict. Use the established logical framework to model the system's behavior and predict outcomes under different conditions. This can aid in decision-making, risk assessment, and strategic planning in fields ranging from ecology to engineering. By understanding and applying the logic of necessary conditions, one can analyze and model complex systems effectively, leading to better insights and more informed decisions across various scientific and technical fields. Coexistence implies that A, B, and C exist together, maintaining a mutual presence. If A exists, then B and C must exist, and vice versa. This triad suggests a system where all components are interdependent and cannot exist in isolation. In an ecological context, consider a symbiotic relationship among three species: bees, flowers, and trees. Bees pollinate flowers, flowers provide nectar for bees, and trees provide habitats for bees. The existence of each species ensures the survival of the others. Bees cannot thrive without flowers. Flowers depend on bees for pollination, and trees provide necessary habitats for bees, creating a network of interdependence, where all must coexist for the ecosystem to be stable. Now, equilibrium implies that the absence of one element implies the absence of the others. If A does not exist, then B and C do not exist, and vice versa. This triad suggests a balanced state where the lack of any single element disrupts the entire system. Consider a chemical equilibrium involving three substances, A, B, and C, in a reversible reaction such as A plus B, reversible reaction C. If substance A is removed, the reaction shifts to produce more A and less B and C to maintain equilibrium, according to Le Chatelier's principle. The absence of A leads to the absence of B and C, and the system remains in a balanced state where the non-existence of one component necessitates the non-existence of the others. Reinforcement indicates a positive feedback loop where each element positively influences the next in a cyclic manner. This triad suggests a system of mutual support where each component strengthens the others. In a neural network, consider three neurons, A, B, and C, forming a positive feedback loop. Neuron A activates neuron B activates neuron C, and neuron C activates neuron A. This creates a reinforcement loop where the activation of any one neuron strengthens the activity of the entire loop, leading to a stable, reinforced pattern of neural activity. Now, feedback implies a negative feedback loop, where the absence of one element leads to the absence of the preceding element in a cyclic manner. This triad suggests a dependency chain where the lack of one component negatively impacts the entire cycle. In an ecosystem, consider a predator-prey relationship involving three species, wolves, deer, and vegetation. If deer populations decline, there are fewer prey for wolves, leading to a decline in wolf populations. A decline in wolves means less predation on deer, potentially allowing deer populations to recover, which impacts vegetation levels. The absence of one component creates a feedback loop affecting the whole system. Causal implies a linear cause and effect relationship with the added condition that if A does not occur, C cannot occur. This triad suggests a hierarchical relationship where A is a prerequisite for C. In genetics, consider the pathway of gene expression where A is a regulatory gene, B is a transcription factor, and C is a structural gene. The activation of gene A causes the production of transcription factor B, which in turn activates gene C. If gene A is not activated, gene C cannot be expressed. This linear causal pathway illustrates how the presence or absence of an initial gene can determine the final gene expression. Now, reversion implies a reverse cause and effect relationship where the absence of a component leads to the absence of the preceding one, but the presence of the last element leads to the first element. This triad suggests a cyclical dependency with a reverse influence direction. In a metabolic pathway, suppose A is an enzyme that catalyzes the production of B, and B is a substrate that produces C. If C is present, it inhibits the enzyme A in a feedback inhibition loop. The absence of B prevents the production of A, and thus no C is produced. This reversion mechanism ensures that the metabolic pathway self-regulates to maintain homeostasis. Nonlinear implies a non-sequential cause and effect relationship where A influences C, which in turn influences B. This triad suggests a complex system with indirect influences. In climate systems, consider the influence of greenhouse gases on global temperature and global temperature on ice melt. Increased greenhouse gases raise global temperatures, which leads to ice melt. This nonlinear relationship means changes in one factor can have cascading effects on others, illustrating the complex, indirect influences within climate dynamics. Retrospective implies a backward-looking influence where the absence of one element affects the preceding elements. This triad suggests a system where current states influence the understanding of previous states. In archaeology, consider how the discovery of an ancient artifact can provide insight into past human behaviors. The absence of such artifacts makes it challenging to infer historical activities. This retrospective analysis depends on current findings to understand historical contexts, showing how the presence or absence of evidence affects our understanding of the past. Inclusive implies that each element influences the next, with the final element influencing both preceding elements. This triad suggests a tightly knit system with strong mutual dependencies. In a biological context, consider an ecosystem where A is a plant species, B is a herbivore, and C is a predator. Plants support herbivores, herbivores support predators, and predators, in turn, help maintain plant populations by controlling herbivore numbers. This inclusive relationship shows how each species supports the existence of the others, leading to a stable ecosystem. Exclusive implies that the absence of one element leads to the absence of the next, and the absence of the first two elements leads to the absence of the third. This triad suggests a system where the absence of any single component disrupts the entire structure. In an immune system response, consider A as an antigen, B as an antibody, and C as a T-cell response. The absence of the antigen means there is no stimulus for antibody or T-cell activation. Without the antigen, the immune response is inactive, demonstrating an exclusive system where the absence of any one component leads to the non-activation of the entire immune response. Conjoined implies that B is dependent on both A and C, while A and C individually influence B. This triad suggests a central node that requires the conjunction of two other elements. In cellular biology, consider B as a central protein that requires the presence of both DNA and RNA to function. DNA produces RNA, and RNA is necessary for the production of the protein B. The central protein thus depends on both DNA and RNA, illustrating a conjoined system where all components must work together for proper cellular function. Bottlenecked implies that the absence of A and C leads to the absence of B, and the absence of B leads to the absence of both A and C. This triad suggests a critical dependency where one element acts as a bottleneck for the others. In a supply chain, consider a manufacturer that relies on raw materials and transportation. If either raw materials or transportation are unavailable, the manufacturer cannot operate. The bottleneck occurs at the manufacturer, which halts production and impacts the entire supply chain, illustrating how the absence of any critical component disrupts the whole system. Harmonic implies that the conjunction of any two elements influences the third. This triad suggests a balanced and synergistic relationship. In a biochemical pathway, consider A as enzyme 1, B as enzyme 2, and C as a metabolic product. The production of the metabolic product requires the concurrent activity of enzyme 1 and enzyme 2. Similarly, the presence of enzyme 1 in the metabolic product is necessary to activate enzyme 2. Additionally, the activity of enzyme 2 in the metabolic product is required to sustain the activity of enzyme 1. This harmonic relationship illustrates how the interplay of these enzymes in the metabolic product ensures the proper functioning of the biochemical pathway. Now, dissonant implies that the absence of one element leads to the absence of the other two. This triad suggests a fragile system where the absence of any single component disrupts the entire structure. In a complex electronic circuit, consider A as a power supply, B as a voltage regulator, and C as an output signal. If the output signal is missing, both the power supply and the voltage regulator are non-functional. If the voltage regulator fails, it leads to the failure of both the power supply and the output signal. Similarly, if the power supply is absent, the voltage regulator and the output signal will also fail. This dissonant relationship highlights the critical interdependence where the absence of any component leads to the failure of the entire system. Convergent implies that each element influences the conjunction of the other two. This triad suggests a highly interdependent system. In an environmental system, consider A as sunlight, B as water, and C as nutrients. The presence of sunlight supports both the availability of water and the uptake of nutrients. Water is essential for the absorption of nutrients and the process of photosynthesis driven by sunlight. Nutrients support plant growth, which in turn helps in water retention and efficient use of sunlight. This convergent relationship illustrates how these environmental factors are interdependent and collectively sustain the ecosystem. On the flip side, divergent implies that the absence of any two elements leads to the absence of the third. This triad suggests a system where the lack of dual support leads to collapse. In a chemical reaction, consider A as the formation of a product, B as the presence of a catalyst, and C as the required temperature. If both the catalyst and the required temperature are absent, the product cannot form. If the product and the required temperature are not present, it implies the catalyst is also not present. Similarly, if the product and the catalyst are absent, the required temperature must also be absent. This divergent relationship demonstrates how the absence of any two critical conditions prevents the occurrence of the third. Combination implies an exclusive or relationship where the presence of one element and the absence of another uniquely determines the third. This triad suggests a system with unique dependencies and exclusions. In an agricultural system, consider A as the presence of nitrogen fertilizer, B as the presence of phosphorus fertilizer, and C as the growth of a specific crop. The presence of nitrogen fertilizer and the absence of phosphorus fertilizer determine the unique growth pattern of the crop. Similarly, the presence of phosphorus fertilizer and the absence of nitrogen fertilizer determine a different growth pattern. The growth of the crop in the absence of nitrogen fertilizer indicates the presence of phosphorus fertilizer. This combination relationship shows how the specific combination of fertilizers and their presence or absence uniquely influences crop growth. Division implies an exclusive or relationship where the absence of one element and the presence of another uniquely determines the third's absence. This triad suggests a system with unique absences and exclusions. In a manufacturing process, consider A as the presence of raw material X, B as the presence of raw material Y, and C as the production of a finished product. The absence of raw material X with the presence of raw material Y results in no finished product. Similarly, the absence of raw material Y with the presence of raw material X also results in no finished product. The production of the finished product can only occur when both raw materials X and Y are present. This division relationship highlights how the specific combinations of material availability and absence determine the production outcome. Association implies an exclusive or relationship and a conditional relationship, where the conjunction of A and C implies B. This triad suggests a system with specific associations and conditions. In a scientific experiment, consider A as a reagent, B as the experimental result, and C as a catalyst. The presence of the catalyst and the absence of the reagent determine the occurrence of the experimental result. If the experimental result is present, but the catalyst is absent, it necessitates the presence of the reagent. Additionally, the combination of the reagent and the catalyst ensures the experimental result. This association relationship illustrates how specific conditions and combinations are required to achieve the desired experimental outcome. Disassociation implies an exclusive or relationship and a conditional absence where the absence of B implies the absence of both A and C. This triad suggests a system with specific disassociations and absences. In a photosynthetic process, consider A as the availability of carbon dioxide, B as the production of glucose, and C as the availability of sunlight. The absence of glucose production with the presence of carbon dioxide indicates the absence of sunlight. Similarly, the absence of glucose production with the presence of sunlight indicates the absence of carbon dioxide. The absence of glucose production implies that both carbon dioxide and sunlight must be absent. This disassociation relationship shows how the absence of a specific outcome indicates the absence of the necessary conditions. Integration implies an exclusive or relationship combined with conditional relationships where the conjunction of A and C implies B. This triad suggests a system where integration of elements leads to specific outcomes. In an integrated circuit, consider A as an input signal, B as the output signal, and C as the power supply. The presence of an input signal results in the output signal only if the power supply is not interrupted. Similarly, the presence of the power supply ensures the output signal only if the input signal is not interrupted. When both the input signal and the power supply are present, the output signal is guaranteed. This integration relationship demonstrates how the combination of input and power conditions determines the circuit's output. Disintegration implies an exclusive or relationship combined with conditional absences where the absence of B implies the absence of both A and C. This triad suggests a system where disintegration of elements leads to specific absences. In a water purification system, consider A as the filtration process, B as the production of clean water, and C as the UV sterilization process. The absence of clean water implies that either the filtration process or the UV sterilization process is not functioning. If clean water is not being produced, it could be due to a failure in the filtration process, unless the UV sterilization is active. If clean water is not being produced, it could also be due to a failure in the UV sterilization process, unless the filtration process is active. This disintegration relationship highlights how the failure to produce clean water indicates issues with the necessary purification processes. By understanding these triadic relationships, you can analyze systems and situations in terms of how elements mutually influence each other, either positively or negatively, and how their presence or absence affects the overall structure. Triadic models offer significant advantages in explaining and analyzing complex systems compared to dialectical reasoning. Their ability to capture nuanced interactions between multiple components, explicitly outline necessary conditions, provide flexibility across contexts, enhance predictive power, and offer comprehensive system analysis makes them particularly suited for scientific and technical applications. While dialectical reasoning remains valuable for understanding change and conflict, triadic models provide a robust framework for analyzing stable, interdependent relationships within multifaceted systems.